Hello, everyone. Welcome. We're about to start recording. Recording is now on. Okay. Well, welcome to a special edition of the Department of Critical Theory and Social Justice's webinar series, The Matrix. Normally subtitled Conversations and Transformations. This one is From the Frontlines. And in this case, we're talking about From the Frontlines, Portland, Oregon. I'm Professor Malik Moazzam Dolat of the CTSJ Department, Critical Theory Social Justice Department, and I'm joined by my colleagues and co-founders, Professor Mary Christianakis.
Hi, everyone.
Hi, and the chair of our department, Professor Caroline Heldman. So just a real quick bit about the series, if you're new to it. The series focuses on pressing current events and seeks to connect our community with experts, scholars, artists, and the most effective activists out there doing the good work. This summer, the seminar and webinar has been focused on two main crises. The first is the complex and far-reaching effects of the COVID-19 pandemic, and also political violence, in particular, the violence of US police forces against Black people and its deep roots and broad effects in our society. On Wednesday of next week, join us for a conversation about neo-colonialism and global medicine, lessons and new approaches, with Dr. Phil Seidenberg of the University of New Mexico Department of Emergency Medicine and formerly faculty of the Center of Global Health at Boston University, who's done a lot of work in global medicine and global health and has had some innovative publications come out of it, trying to change the way that it's done. So very quickly, most of us are used to the Zoom format now, but if you look at the bottom of your screen, you'll see there's a Q&A button. Click the Q&A button, post a question, and we'll get to it throughout the semester. We've reserved some time at the end for just audience Q&A. Carolyn, there's already someone saying hi, Geraldine Stapleton. Okay, and I'll turn it over now to Professor Heldman.
Hello, Geraldine. So glad you can join us and everyone who has decided to spend their Friday afternoon with us. I am going to share with you the speakers' bios. We will have a participant joining us later. Her name is pseudonymously Sarah. Sarah describes herself as a Black woman, a university student, and an activist. She helped to create her high school's first Black student union and has been doing her best to fight for justice ever since. Also on the screen is Nonda Hanneman. Nonda graduated from Occidental College in 2010 and is currently a third-year medical student at Oregon Health and Science University. She hopes to combine her passion for social justice and her love of medicine in her future career as a physician. And Kelly is also with us today, Kelly Simon from the ACLU of Oregon. She's the interim legal director there. So we are so lucky that she has a few moments to join us because of her busy schedule right now in combating what's happening with federal troops in Oregon. Before joining the ACLU of Oregon, she was an attorney for youth rights and justice in the state, and she was a law clerk for the U.S. Department of the Interior, Office of the Solicitor, the Portland Regional Office. So welcome, so great you could join us. So Nonda, let's start with you. Tell us a little bit about your life path. How is it that you ended up on the streets of Portland? So tell us about your journey as an activist, why it is important for you to be on the streets, and then tell us a bit about what you've witnessed and experienced there.
Okay, great. Thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here. And before I start, I do have to say, just since I said it in my bio, that my views are my own and don't represent OHSU. So I just want to get that out of the way. My path to getting here, I'm from Oregon. I was born in Portland and I grew up in Eugene. My family was always really supportive of activism and of just getting out there and speaking up and standing up for what was right. And so I never really questioned things like this or questioned being involved. And I think where I really started to get more involved in activism was when I was at Occidental, specifically with you in going to New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina and doing community work there, small protests there and marches with the community members. And then from there, working on the Obama campaign in 2008, also while I was at Occidental. These things just always kind of seemed natural to me. I couldn't imagine not being out there and not trying to be a part of something bigger than me to bring about change. So I've kind of just dabbled in different political campaigns and events ever since getting more involved at Occidental. And that's what got me here to being out there in Portland right now.
And what have you seen on the streets? How often have you been out? When are you going out? Who is out protesting? What have you seen?
Right. There's so much I could say. So if I start rambling or if you have more questions about something I say, please let me know. I first went out the very first Friday after George Floyd was murdered. There was a vigil in North Portland, which I went to. And then I went home pretty early that night, so I didn't go home downtown to that first protest. And then I went out again on Sunday. And for those first couple of weeks, I was out almost every night. I think I took off maybe one night each week. And that's when things were predominantly marches, and we would march typically from the east side of Portland across the Willamette River to downtown, and then occupy space outside of the Justice Center or in by Pioneer Square Courthouse. And gosh, I've seen everything. I've been out there as a protester myself, marching. I've been out there registering people to vote, and I've also been out there with OHSU providing aid to protesters. And I've seen people of all ages. I've seen children, dogs, families, elderly people, people of all different abilities, people of all different races. Just everyone, it seems like, is out there, no matter whether it was the marches or whether it was being down at the Justice Center. It's a huge variety.
And so there's been some kind of criticism of Portland, or at least an observation that Portland is a predominantly white city, and most of the protesters are white, and they're marching for Black Lives Matter. And we've seen this throughout the United States. We have prominent white communities. And I'm wondering if you could speak more to that, and also maybe more, so I don't know exactly what the question is there, except to say, you know, what does it mean when you have a predominantly white city and a majority white protesters protesting for Black Lives Matter? And also to add on to that, you know, the moms, there's been a lot of rhetoric from the moms who have formed lines, and then vets who form lines, and then the dads with leaf blowers. How do you think the media commentary might be different about the wall of moms if it was a Black wall of moms, for example? You know, how white womanhood and white motherhood and conceptions of that playing into how we talk about Portland and the protests there?
Yeah, I think that, I mean, being that Portland is a predominantly white city, it's not surprising to me at all that the protesters have been majority white. And I've really tried to listen to Black leaders and local Black community organizers in navigating where I was going and how I was protesting and what I was showing up to and what I was doing. And from what I've heard from those leaders and folks speaking at the protest is that who are Black community organizers, is that it's important for white people to be out there standing up, speaking up. This isn't just a Black person issue where only, you know, Black people need to be showing up. It's important for us to be showing up too. So I think that I obviously cannot speak for any Black person, but from what I've been told from being there is that anyone just needs to be involved, and it's just important for anyone to be speaking up. I don't know if that answers your first part of the question.
It does. And to follow up on that, Nonda, are there what are the protest rules for white protesters at a Black Lives Matter protest? What are some of the things you're doing to make sure that you are elevating and supporting Black leadership?
Yeah, I think things that I've specifically noticed was, especially because the marches are a little bit dying down now, and it's more so people gathering at the Justice Center. But in the beginning, when the marches were happening nightly, it was making sure that the people at the front of the march were were Black people and people of color, and not that white people weren't stepping in front of that. It was making sure that people throughout the crowds who were holding megaphones to lead the chants and everything were Black people, and so just making sure that those voices are being elevated and that those people are the ones seen up at the front. And then a lot of nights there's been speakers, and so again, it's just giving that space to Black community leaders in Portland and not to white people. So I think it's largely been the message has been show up and use your body and bring your presence, but then let Black people shine and listen to them. And so that's largely what I've tried to do, is just elevate those voices and listen to those leaders and not get in there and try to take over.
So let's talk now about what you've experienced regarding violence, or what you've witnessed in terms of violence. And Kelly's going to talk to us about the constitutional issues involved with what Portland and other cities in a few moments. But can you tell us what you experienced and witnessed, and in terms of protesters, federal forces, local law enforcement?
Definitely. So I haven't experienced any violence with protesters themselves. I've experienced nothing but just support and unity and peace. And it's been really, really beautiful to see the community come together, especially, at the marches, there would be just tons of booths around with medical supplies, with water, with food, everything free to protesters, and people just really wanting to support everyone who's there. Down at the Justice Center, there's been Riot Ribs has gotten a lot of attention, feeding protesters for free, and anyone just in the community who's in need. On Wednesday night, there was a barber shop set up outside the Justice Center. There's been safe spaces for speaking. It's just been really amazing to see the community come together and try to provide support for everyone that's there. And I've really just seen people wanting to gather, wanting to occupy space, chanting, speakers, but nothing that has provoked, in my opinion, what has been being put upon the protesters, which almost every night inevitably turns into tear gas, rubber bullets, the flashbangs, chasing protesters, beating medics. And it has been, what's been really interesting to me is it's felt very random when they decide to do those things, whether it was the Portland police or now the federal agents, because I had been there nights late when things like the fence around the Justice Center were moved, and I thought, oh gosh, they're gonna go crazy, they're gonna be really hard tonight because they don't like it when anyone touches the fence, and they left us alone that night. And then other nights where it's been completely quiet and not a lot going on, and then the attacks have been really ruthless. So it's really random when they decide to use force, and I haven't seen anything on the side of the protesters that I believe deserves that type of force that's being used.
Can you talk a little bit more about that, Nonda, about some of the myths that have been perpetrated by media about the protesters, and about Portland in general and the protests that are happening there? What doesn't match up for you in terms of what you're reading in the news or seeing in national news and what you're experiencing on the ground?
Yeah, that's been really frustrating, and especially talking to people who watch the media and just go with what they're saying and question my being there, and think that I've turned into an angry anarchist and violent person, because the most I've seen would be maybe people throwing water bottles or things like stuffed animals or just like very harmless things. And that's usually one or two people in the crowd that decides to do that. And then 99% of the people otherwise are standing and just occupying space. I think it's really just about occupying the space. So, to hear the language of that we're violent and that there's a mob and that the the police or the federal agents are having to use this force to control the crowd is just nothing that I've witnessed. And nothing that, you know, there's a lot of people I know going to these and they haven't witnessed anything like that either. So it's been frustrating to see that talked about in that way.
The media framing, I can imagine. One last question. For someone who is not on the ground, who is not experienced, you mentioned a number of things. You mentioned the rubber bullets, you mentioned flashbangs, you mentioned, you know, the tear gas or whatever gas they happen to be using. Can you talk a little bit more about what these things are? Someone may not know what a flashbang is or might not know why that's used, and you know, it's tactical, and I don't know how much you know about the tactics, but talk about being there in the moment, and then all of a sudden you've got flashbangs, you've got tear gas, you've got rubber bullets coming at you. What does that feel like? What is that experience?
Yeah, it's not comfortable. So the flashbangs, I don't really know. It's, as far as I understand, the tactics are to try to break up the crowd and to get people to disperse. So that usually seems like they'll start with the flashbangs, which is just a really, really loud noise that's kind of just debilitating. And it's a little scary of like, what was that? Was that an explosive? What? And so those, notice those usually start first. And then I just put my earplugs in. And then usually after that is when tear gas will happen, which again is just to try to disperse the crowd. And it burns your eyes, it makes you cough, it burns your skin. It is very disorienting, especially with how much has been used in the last couple of weeks. I haven't personally experienced this, but I've had friends who have been caught in the tear gas and they can't tell which direction it's coming from because there's so much. And so they don't know which direction to go to get out, to get to safety. You know, some of these people have asthma and other respiratory problems that they need to get out of there, and they don't know which way to go. And then the rubber bullets are supposedly a safe thing to use, again, to try to break up the crowd and they're supposed to not cause serious injuries. However, people are being hit in the face, having serious brain damage, eye damage, losing their sight. There was someone who was hit in the back of the neck, and one of the medics that was volunteering with OHSU was carrying them as they were seizing, trying to get them to safety. So it's these tactics that are said to be nonviolent and to break up the crowd, but they can cause very serious injury. And it's scary not knowing when those are going to be used. They used to kind of give a warning, but that has pretty much gone away now. And then on top of that, you're worrying about things like cars or anti-protesters coming in and being violent. So it's really a very high stressful situation, not knowing what's going to happen.
Anything else you'd like to share with us before we move over to Kelly, giving an analysis of what you're experiencing in terms of the law and constitution?
I think I just really want to emphasize how amazing it's been to see the community come together, and how just like supportive and caring and loving really everyone has been to try to include people that are being down there and supportive of people being down there. And the protesters are not scary and are really just trying to occupy the space. And it's the way that they're being treated for what they're doing is just, it's just disgusting. And I didn't get a chance to comment on the Wall of Moms. So if you want to come back to that later, but
sure, if you'd like to comment on that.
Yeah, I think I just wanted to say that there has been kind of some controversy around that, but for the most part, when I've been down at the protests and the Wall of Moms has been there, it's been, you know, the more bodies that are down there, the better. The more of a crowd we have, the better to protect us against those tactics that break everyone up and to isolate people. And so I think largely it's appreciated that there's just more people there. And we can go into, there's, you know, more difficulties with representation and how that's been. But think just having more bodies down there has been appreciated and has brought more people out too, that had gone home or that hadn't been out before. So, yeah.
Thank you, Nonda, and please stick around. We'll have a Q&A session, and I'm sure you'll have lots of questions and comments after Kelly speaks. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Nonda. While we're waiting for Sarah to hopefully join us, let's get started with the interim legal director, the ACLU of Oregon, who is extremely busy right now dealing with everything that Nonda's been talking about. Thank you for joining us. I know you literally just came out of a hearing to join us, so appreciate it. So our first question, I guess, should be talking about these federal officers, although you can start off providing context and responding to what you've heard, but maybe as you come out of that, you can tell us a little bit about the way the Trump administration sent unidentified, as far as anyone can tell, federal officers into the city. And can you tell us who these officers are and some of the problems you're facing with them?
Yeah, and I may back this up a little bit because I think that there's been a lot of attention on the federal officers right now, but the tactics that we're seeing aren't necessarily new tactics. Not new to our local police and not new to the federal agencies that we're seeing. And so since you asked specifically about the anonymous kind of nature of what's happening, we were already dealing with anonymity of our local police. We certainly knew which agencies they were from, but we even had officers covering their kind of names and identifiers so that if we wanted to hold individuals accountable for the severe violations we were already seeing from local law enforcement, it was a challenge. And I think that raises First Amendment issues in and of itself. But so we started, just to give folks a little context of where this is happening. We have a kind of federal free speech plaza. We have a city park. We have a local kind of court building. We have a federal court building, city hall, county sheriffs, and jail. It's all in this one center. And so sometimes when protest happens there in Portland, which happens frequently in Portland, we have a strong tradition of protests in Portland. We do see federal officers there, but they're federal officers, Federal Protective Services officers who do kind of protect or act to police the federal properties that I just mentioned. But we started to see military fatigues come out, and it raised a lot of alarm for us. We also started to see planes that were identified with federal government agencies. What we've learned so far about who these folks are has gone beyond the kind of general marshals that might be in the courthouse, keeping order and decorum in the courtroom, and beyond the Federal Protective Services officers that are they're on kind of a more standard basis. So we've seen special units created, special deputization happening by the Department of Justice. We've seen a unit called BORTAC, that's kind of one of the most militarized and racist police units in our country. So there's lots of information that we've learned about who these folks are, and lots of information we still don't know, actually. We're still trying to figure out exactly who and how policing is happening in our streets right now.
So you, back, as you were saying, before the federal forces arrived under, I think, I don't know for sure, but it seems like the name of this federal effort is what, like Diligent Valor or something? Is that right?
There are lots of ridiculous names, in my opinion, about kind of what the operations are.
But you were dealing with the city of Portland, or you got a temporary restraining order against the city of Portland police, and then added the federal officers. What was going on that led you to seek that temporary restraining order?
Yeah, so I want to be sure the organization Don't Shoot Portland, Black-led organization that has been a real leader for many years in organizing protests against racist police brutality in our city, gets credit for filing the first lawsuit against our local police for use of force tactics, then we filed a kind of sister lawsuit to protect those who were there to document what was happening to activists on the ground. So first we filed against just the local police, First Amendment case on behalf of both press and legal observers to protect their right to document and make sure that their exercise of those rights was not being chilled by law enforcement action. And as we saw the feds come in, those kind of military looking feds that I described earlier, it seemed that while both Don't Shoot Portland and our case were able to achieve temporary restraining orders to prohibit local police from violating folks' rights, the feds very quickly took that space up and were doing the same behaviors. So we knew that we had to get into court quickly and make sure that all of the police in Portland were being restrained in the same way and being held accountable to the Constitution.
So I understand that there's some pushback against this restraining order that was granted. What's going on with that?
Yeah, so that was actually part of the discussion in the hearing this morning. We actually filed a motion for contempt just a few days ago because we've continued to see very deliberate, what I perceived as very deliberate violations of our temporary restraining order. The federal government has taken the position that this temporary restraining order is unworkable. They hilariously cited the clouds of tear gas for making it hard to distinguish who press are in the streets. I'm still baffled by that one personally. Or they said, judge, turn it into preliminary injunction, which is kind of a longer standing, similar acting court function or kind of court order that you can get to prohibit behaviors. But that type of court order is something that can immediately appeal up to the Ninth Circuit, so up to a higher court, and have it reviewed. I think the hearing went well today, and we'll see where it goes from there. There were no decisions made, but yeah, I don't know. The government certainly isn't happy to be under a court order and facing contempt, I'm guessing.
So what other issues are you facing, and what other work do you have going to protect the protesters and their rights?
Yeah, and so I guess I'll kind of paint the picture of the various kind of First Amendment activity that we're seeing attacked right now in violation of other amendments of our Constitution as well. I don't know if we can fully discuss all of the constitutional violations today, but I'm so happy that we have an OHSU student, Nonda, today, because we do have clients from OHSU as well who have been acting as medics to injured protesters. As Nonda described, there's really been a beautiful kind of aid and community, kind of organic community that's developed amongst the broader crowd of protesters and others in Portland. And so whereas the Don't Shoot case is kind of your typical First Amendment activity, or your very traditional and easy to understand speech activity, and the press and legal observers are kind of the right to record and document, and the free press that's protected in our First Amendment. These medics have a different kind of expressive activity, and their expressive activity is really this rendering aid to the protesters. And we've seen other cases where there have been organizations that provide food for the homeless, for example, who have been had that activity protected under the First Amendment. So our theory of that case is the same. It's like that is their expressive activity, and folks are being targeted with force for engaging in that behavior.
But what does that look like? What do you mean they're being targeted with force?
Yeah, so we've seen evidence literally of folks trying to render aid to an injured protester getting shot at while they're trying to render that aid. We've seen medical supplies destroyed. There's an organization that I'm still learning about, but that sounds really neat to me. They call themselves the Witches on Twitter. It's I believe they're a queer, Black, and femme-led organization that's been providing supplies and similar sort of aid to protesters. And they've had some of their materials destroyed. We've seen Nonda mentioned Riot Ribs, who's been providing food to protesters, had water bottles kind of stabbed and emptied by law enforcement. So there's a real deliberate attack, it seems, on anybody who wants to support this protest right now or tell the truth about what's happening. So those are two of our cases. We also have a case about surveillance from local law enforcement, and are looking at surveillance at the federal level as well. There have been these snatch and grab tactics, or these kidnapping type tactics used. There's another case that we aren't bringing, but another lawyer who we work with on behalf of a church who is claiming that, hey, our kind of faith requires us to engage in social justice and support this movement. And we're being prohibited from engaging in our faith-based activities. So yeah, all sorts of kind of cases are coming out of this right now, both ACLU cases and others.
One of our audience members asked a great question, so I'll just read it to you. It's, can you ask the ACLU director to articulate the constitutional foundations and premises of the right of protesters to occupy the streets?
Yeah,
and
so
one last bit here. So what is the legal line that feds may not cross while protecting federal property?
okay, I see those two things as slightly different. So streets and federal property. Bottom line that I think what gets lost in kind of the legal wonkery is, if people aren't being violent, or if all they're doing is protesting, standing up and speaking in places where they're lawfully allowed to be, no kind of prohibition of that activity and no use of force certainly is justified. So I'll start with the streets, because that kind of, in First Amendment law, you have these things called traditional public forums or limited public forums, and your rights are most protected in what's called a traditional public forum. Taking to the streets, being in the federal free speech plaza, being in a city park, these are quintessential kind of traditional public forums. And so protesters' rights are heavily protected in those areas. And there are certain law enforcement purposes like safety. For example, Nonda mentioned cars. I think, when you're on the street, there are certain government interests as well that can get balanced with reasonable regulations. But I would posit that tear gas is not a reasonable regulation that balances those interests. And then in terms of federal property, again, it depends on what, are you talking about the free speech plaza? Are you talking about going into the courthouse when it's closed, which I don't think I've seen anybody actually do that. But there is some limited authority to have federal police, certainly, at the federal properties and in enforcing reasonable, what we call reasonable time, place, and manner regulations there.
Yeah.
That's a short version. First Amendment law is very fact specific and complicated.
Right.
I hope that gives some big picture insight.
I could see that in your filings, the Fourth Amendment, the seizure element of the Fourth Amendment is brought up in a couple of them. Can you talk a little bit about what's going on that led you to file under that?
Yeah, so when you have force used against you, the kind of case law has interpreted that as implicating your rights to be free for an unreasonable seizure. And if you're being grabbed off the streets into an unmarked van, you certainly are having your rights to be free from an unlawful seizure implicated. So the Fourth Amendment kind of raises those excessive force issues. The Fourth Amendment raises your right to be free from being arrested without any suspicion or cause, which we are also seeing in the streets of Portland. So that's why we've raised issues like that. It also protects your right to have to not have your property unreasonably seized. So OHSU, for example, had medical supplies and aid supplies taken. We've seen yeah, I guess those are the only ones in our lawsuits. But there are also issues like houseless folks who are on the streets and having property destroyed. And so those kind of speak to some of the Fourth Amendment issues that we're seeing.
Okay.
As well as, yeah, go ahead.
No, that's fine. Go ahead.
I was going to say, you know, as well as your right to be free from unreasonable searches, you know, when you think about surveillance and things like that, we may see those types of constitutional issues raised.
Are they seizing phones and cameras, the federal or local police?
We did have to address that issue in our temporary restraining order with respect to journalists. So some journalists have been subject to arrest and have had their cameras and other documenting devices taken and not returned. So we were able to get that as part of the restraining order that type of seizure would not, unlawful seizure would not be permitted.
I guess the couple last questions here as we get ready to answer some other questions, and there's another good one in there that I'm really eager to hear the answer to. But first, how is the relationship between the local law enforcement and you know, Portland and Oregon political leaders? How's that going with the federal forces being deployed? I know that that's shifting quite a bit.
Yeah, and to be frank, it's still a little bit unclear to us exactly what cooperation may or may not look like between local and federal police. But the most recent news with respect to the federal government and their kind of presence and relationship with local police is that our Governor Kate Brown, announced that she reached a deal with the federal government that some of the troops would be, or some of the agents would be withdrawing, and instead we would have state police put in place. And I believe there was some reporting, it might have been this morning, time is a little bit crazy in my brain right now, that the state police would kind of start to act as a go-between between city and federal. Our Portland police used to be part of a joint terrorism task force, and advocates were able to urge the city of Portland to pull out of that task force, which they have. But I just, it seems to me that there still has been some sort of coordination all along here, and it's something we're still trying to learn more about.
I don't know if you know much about this, or you know, you've got a lot on your plate already, but yesterday there was a story about the DHS intelligence wing doing domestic journalist surveillance and putting out intel reports on them. Have you been following that at all? Because there's a question we should get to about other forms of surveillance. We don't have to answer that question if you don't.
I did briefly see that there was an article about that. I don't have a lot of additional information beyond that article. But it's yet another very concerning tactic that this government is using right now to silence the truth and silence, in particular, a movement for Black lives. And I think that our government has a long history of silencing people demanding that Black Lives Matter in various forms, people demanding an end to racist police brutality. And so we all need to remain vigilant for these tactics and make sure that we're holding our government officials accountable. Yeah, we got to keep going on those.
And a political question here, which, you know, feel free to bow out of. What do you think the end game of the administration is here? Why are they sending federal forces?
Well, I don't know the answer to that, but I do know, again, that this country has a long history of silencing protests that challenge the racism in our institutions. And, you know, in a moment where we need to be really reimagining these institutions, yeah, it's sadly not a surprise that we're seeing tactics to silence this type of protest, this type of message. And I think we need to all continue to interrogate why we see these responses to declarations that Black Lives Matter.
You can see the difference in the way they handled the anti-mask protests, armed people challenging, sort of federal protective services, as far as I could tell, versus this. And, the weirdest part of this was I work on the Middle East a bit, and there was this deck of cards they created in the special ops community, especially, to go hunt down terrorists. And they created one for protesters and journalists in Portland. They seem to be passing those around. So we see these, we see the war on terror come home, I guess, is the way to talk about that, these tactics, these military units. Caroline, so we're going to take some questions from the audience now, but Caroline, if you have any follow-ups there.
Yeah, and on the political question, I don't, who knows the answer to why this is happening now, but I can tell you as somebody who monitors right-wing news, I can tell you how these images are being used. So there's this narrative that there, are these lawless cities with protesters and violent criminals, and that Donald Trump is sending troops into different cities and is, putting down this unrest. And so a lot of this narrative is making its way into right-wing news. And if you're in that bubble, you believe things about the world that simply aren't true. And I don't know how else to say it. It's rather remarkable. And it looks like his strategy is to double down on, he's using this in profoundly racist ways, right? It's this fear tactic that, if they want to defund the police, and there's all of this lawlessness, and the lawlessness definitely, obviously around Black Lives Matter, but the ways in which he's talked about sending troops to Chicago and Detroit, it's around Black violence, right? And so he's using the rhetorical threat, he's rhetorically using the threat of Black violence in order to stir up emotions and fears amongst his white supporters. So I think that's probably part of the motivation, but it's rather remarkable if you're watching right-wing news, how little it resembles what's actually happening on the ground.
So here's a quick question that maybe we can answer in two different ways. Kate Summers, who asked a question about BORTEC, looked it up herself, but I think it's worth bringing up here. So maybe Nonda, you can talk about your experience with these people, but Kelly, if you could tell us who BORTEC is and why you see them as a particularly aggressive group. I think you're muted.
I was actually hoping Kelly could explain who exactly they are first, because I'm not sure exactly who they are.
I, having not been doing immigration law, I'm also trying to learn a lot about BORTEC and who exactly they are. So BORTEC is a special tactical unit under the Department of Homeland Security, which also has the Border Patrol and ICE. I even forget what the acronym is, which is embarrassing. I just have so much information in my brain right now.
Is this the Customs and Border Patrol? Is this the CBP group?
That's CBP. I forget what BORTEC actually stands for. That was what I was going to look it up for everyone. Anyway, it's going to take me too much time.
Don't worry about that, but what does that look like?
Yeah, I think it is a specially trained tactical militarized unit, and I think that's what's important to think about. This is not a general policing law enforcement, like they're not trained in the way your kind of city police are trained. They are tactically trained in military tactics. They are an organization that is part of a part of our federal government that has seen a huge increase in funding to bring some of these scary tactics to our immigrant community. I think that's what's important is, we as we think about who we want to divest from, or who we want to reimagine, this is a unit that has been wreaking havoc, not newly on our country, but on our country for a while. It's just in a context that maybe is less visible. Yeah, so I think that for me, that's something that's important to keep bringing to the forefront, is these are units of law enforcement that we have government controls over, and that have been terrorizing our communities, just maybe communities that are less visible, especially in the whitest city in America, Portland. I think it's time for us to interrogate our privilege as we think about how we've been shielded from units like this in the past.
Yeah. Nonda, do you have any experience with these camouflaged units?
I mean, other than seeing them and being, it's hard for me to know exactly who each unit is. So I couldn't say that I've specifically had any experience with them.
Yeah, so it says, Kate says that she's reading an article. Thanks, Kate. That they're a SWAT team, basically. That's what I had read, that they're basically, it's like a hyper SWAT team, like a super SWAT team. And that their job is to respond to terrorist threats. And I just want to say, like, the way in which the broad powers and tactical flexibility that was given in the war on terror has come back in dealing with anti-racist protests is important to keep in mind. That these things, there's always these lines about colonial practices always tend to come home. And this is one of those situations where we can see that happening. And it's why it's important to pay attention when those powers start getting handed out and, to be used abroad. One question for Kelly here from Victoria Guile. So living about 20 blocks away, I'm reading it. Kelly, you can read it too if you pop up the Q&A.
Yep.
Living about 20 blocks away, I assume not from the nowhere where we are in cyberspace, but in Portland near the protests. I've been eyewitnessing an unmarked drone. So sorry, an unlit and unmarked drone with accompanying possibly a helicopter above it, doing circles over downtown area from dark to 2 a.m. It seems to be used for surveillance. Drone usage has been banned recently, but maybe just civilian use. Is there something that I can do or that the ACLU can do?
So this is something ACLU is looking at. Some news outlets have had helicopters. Some news outlets do use drones, and law enforcement uses aircraft and drones. So it's something that we are trying to learn more about. I think you can go on our website. We have an intake link that you could submit this information to, so that we can incorporate it into the things we're looking at. You could reach out to news outlets to see if they know about it. Yeah, it really is hard to know, to be honest, which it makes it scary. So it's hard to know. And I think that's actually just like a major theme right now that is concerning to us as we think about being in, a fight to save our democracy. Is like, it's hard to know what's actually happening sometimes. So yeah, but I unfortunately don't have great answers. It could be media, it could be law enforcement, it could be a private person. I'm not sure how to tell on a drone.
Okay.
Nonda and Kelly, basically the same question. Nonda, if folks want to head down to the protests, what should they expect? And Kelly, if folks head down to the protests in Portland or any major city, what are their rights?
I think it's great if folks want to head down, and it's just important to take safety precautions. So don't head down alone. If you can go with someone who's been down there and maybe has a little more experience, that's the best thing. And then from just passing along what I've been told is to wear dark clothing, things that you can't easily be identified. Folks are now, almost everyone is wearing helmets because of the rubber bullets being fired. And it seems to be being aimed at people's heads. wearing goggles if you have, for the tear gas, a gas mask, if a respirator if you have that, and obviously masks in general for COVID, which I've been happy to see most people wearing. And then it's smart, there'll be people down there. Just last night, I forgot to write the lawyer's number on my arm, and there's people going around with Sharpies and giving out the phone numbers for if you are arrested, having a phone number to call. But really just trying to be as safe as possible and take those precautions. And it really kind of starts out as just a community gathering, people hanging out, there's music, people just talking, and then as it gets later, there'll be speakers, and then there's just people occupying the space. You can kind of decide how late you want to be there, and when just feels like the right time for you to leave or go home. So, but we need more people, so it'd be great.
And as far as your rights go, though, I would also just encourage thinking through safety as well. Unfortunately, the Constitution, it has become something in Portland we might have to vindicate after it's violated, or we are vindicating after it's been violated. But you do have a right to protest. You do have a right to gather with your community and demand that Black Lives Matter. Those rights are most protected in those kind of spaces that I described are traditional public forums. So things like streets, sidewalks, parks, free speech plazas, which I just find that one so ironic. And you have the right not to be subjected to excessive force. And so, I think one point that the Don't Shoot Portland case is making is, even if people want to engage in civil disobedience, for example, that doesn't give anybody the right. Even if we want to make a stand by defying a law, standing in the street when somebody tells you it may be unlawful, which I don't think that is, but that's a whole nother webinar. Let's say it is, and you want to do that. That doesn't mean you should be gassed and shot at. If you want to be taken into custody to make a stand, because you think a law should be questioned, you also don't need to be, you are protected from excessive force in that situation. And I think that gets lost too. That just because somebody may be violating a law, then that means the force is justified. It's absolutely not how that works. And if you do find yourself arrested, definitely get the number that Nonda mentioned. We can follow up with that. You have the right to an attorney. You have the right to remain silent. Remember those things. And you have the right to record the police and the abuses that you're seeing. That is also protected by the First Amendment. So those are a few of your rights. And again, think about your safety as well, unfortunately.
So when we see the images of people being put in vans in New York and different cities in Portland, how is the Constitution being violated there? And I assume that's what you were going to ask, Malik. Like when we see these images, how is the Constitution being violated? I'm hearing excessive force, no probable cause, no Miranda rights.
Yep, that. And again, I just want to reiterate that that's not a new tactic. We're seeing it used on protesters now, but that's something we've seen in our Latino community in particular. In Oregon, folks just being disappeared off the streets. But yes, so you have the right not to be arrested. You have the right not to be stopped if there's no suspicion of being engaged in criminal activity. You have the right not to be taken into custody if there's no probable cause that you have engaged in criminal activity. So yeah, I mean, the things you just mentioned are certainly constitutional violations. And again, it's that Fourth Amendment unlawful seizure.
Yeah. Okay, so we have one more question coming in here. Yeah, so from Marla, that's right. So one of the things I could say, so Marla just says, thank you everyone, thanks to the ACLU Oregon. This is so important, she's a history professor. Our democracy is in jeopardy and collective public action is imperative, that's right. And there is an interesting tool from the ACLU, actually. I think it's a national app where you can record what's going on, and it automatically uploads it to, you know, a cloud server, so that even if your phone is served, that documentation of abuse remains. Do I have that right,
That's
Kelly?
correct. Yeah, there's an app, it's called Mobile Justice, and right now the app is state specific. So if you're in Oregon, be sure to download the Oregon app. We can probably include that in the follow-up as well, a link to information about that. So yeah, it uploads to a database that we have, and we can review and go from there. It's kind of another form of intake, similar to going on the web form.
And you've mentioned everyone has mentioned a bunch of times, actually, the Don't Shoot Portland group. Can you tell us a little bit more about them and their work before we shut down?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the founders, Teresa Rayford, is a Black woman who's been an activist in her community for a long time. I think, you know, her story, she's been pretty public about her story, so you can find more information online, but it started with kind of racist experiences she had with the police when she was younger and her family experienced. So she's been organizing art displays and all sorts of different types of protest with folks of all ages for a long time in Portland and elsewhere, organizing around the police murdering of Black people in Portland and Oregon. And so yeah, it's a group that has been a leader on this issue for a long time. I encourage you to look them up. They're on Twitter as well. Both Teresa and Don't Shoot Portland are on Twitter. Yeah, there's probably a lot more you could say. I know we're hitting time here, but I definitely encourage folks to check them out.
We'll send out links to everything we've talked about. I'll put that together. It'll take, you know, part of the afternoon, but I'll send it out with the video of this if you want to review any part of it. I am sure that Kelly has to get back and save our rights some more for the rest of the day.
No heroes. No, I'm not a hero. It is all a community effort. Absolutely.
Well,
everyone who's out there is doing their part.
And you can support Don't Shoot Portland. We'll send out links for them and the founder or the leader of that group. And if you have any other questions, you can email us at ctsjevents at oxy.edu, and we'll pass on questions if it seems appropriate. And you can go to our website, oxy.edu/matrix, to watch video of this and find the links if you lose it in your email. The PDF for our links and information will be up. Thank you to everyone. Caroline?
Yeah, thank you, Kelly and Nonda. It's really interesting to get the perspective from the ground and then the legal perspective, and putting those two things together really speaks to really how much our democracy is imperiled. So thank you both.
Yeah, thank you for fighting the good fight out there. Really appreciate it. And thank you for taking the time, both of you. I know everyone's very busy. Okay. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.